Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Meeting is called to order, and our focus and purpose for this work session, of course, is our fiscal year 2015 budget. We've received the superintendent's proposed budget a few weeks ago and designated today and next Wednesday and the 26th, if necessary, to finalize our budget for next year. We provided some documents to you that includes an agenda for today that will guide our discussion, and we will follow this agenda as presented. Dr. Thornton will give us an overview after the opening comments from the superintendent of the operating budget, and then an update on the state's budget, followed by a few other recommended adjustments that's in the documentation that you have received, and then we will begin our discussion. And our discussion will follow the recommendations that we've received from Dr. King and Dr. Thornton. Dr. King?
Chairman Houston, members of the board, administration, and guests. Just to briefly recap in reference to our budgetary travels at this point in terms of allowing us to be at the point that we are today. As of February 19th, we presented the board with a proposed operating budget for 2014-15. The proposal included additional expenditure amounts over the current year budget, and the purpose of that was really to absorb certain required costs, as well as to advance the priorities around the services we provide for our children. Simply put, the focus has been, as it relates to planning, on moving the strategic plan forward as necessary, allowing for necessary adjustments to be made related to action steps from a formative standpoint as well. Examples of the costs that were added to our base budget included the following, just as a recap and a refresher. Absorption of 5% of a health increase premium rate increase for employees, absorption of that. That was an example of costs we added to our base budget. In addition, continued transition of our school nurses to Norfolk Public Schools budget and off of the state's payroll. Also, the addition of grade 8 teachers to the new Crossroads School. We offset those items with budget balancing strategies in order to move us forward. Some of those strategies consisted of reducing non-school-based operating budgets, realigning secondary staffing due to a decreased enrollment in reference to student enrollment, and modifying pupil-teacher ratios at the secondary level to increase no more than a ratio or a proportion of one student. In terms of the funding support that you were able to review for Tier 2 and Tier 3 priorities involving effective delivery of high-quality instructional services for our students, we also included dollars for technology infrastructure and support, professional learning for teachers and leaders, and expansion of preschool early learning, and the first year of funding for the Open Campus Academy, proposed Open Campus Academy. The overall budget proposal was developed to prioritize our many needs and to reflect the necessary funding for advancing the necessary plans strategically related for Phase 1, Year 2 of that rollout. After that preliminary spending plan was provided to the board in February, we received feedback from the board, had discussion along the line, engaged discussion with the governance, amongst the governance leadership team. We also received input from stakeholders during the board's March 5th budget hearing, with additional items for research and consideration placed on the table. We move forward to the point really reiterating the fact that we value all input, we value all feedback received from the public on March 5th, and brought the items that were mentioned back with us to have further conversation with the administration. Today, we will have additional information to review with you regarding those items and any tweaks or modifications that will be suggested to the board or recommended to the board from the administration. Among the messages we heard, many of them centered on pretty clearly the request for the governance leadership team to demonstrate an emphasis on the importance of attracting and retaining staff through a salary increase to show that we value our employees and their contributions to the school division, and indeed we do. Also, other local divisions have rolled out their proposed operating budgets at this time over the past several weeks, and all have included modest pay increases for employees. You will see in the materials that we are providing you today the cost of providing a 2% pay increase to employees as an addition to our base budget. At a time when our strategic plan calls on us to make very important decisions, and especially around the effort to attract and retain highly qualified, highly effective teachers, highly effective classified and certified staff, we feel that we, of course, cannot afford to allow the gap to widen in terms of our ability to be very competitive in that regard. And so we cannot afford to be a system that can't compete with the Hampton Road area because of a sole salary piece. So this whole notion would continue to widen the gap and the disparities among local school divisions. And so, of course, we don't want any of those variables to work to the organization's detriment. Another item of importance upon which we have received feedback from stakeholders as well as from the Young Richter study is the Comprehensive Career and Technical Education Academy, high school. In order to begin the lengthy process of identifying funding sources for our new high school, we must demonstrate its commitment to the project by budgeting, planning as necessary to complete the engineering work, architectural designs, that kind of thing, to show where our commitment really falls. So all of these things are going to be things that are going to be important for discussion. We have provided this item to you as a phased-in approach, with approximately $3 million in year one. Of course, that is something that can be discussed and modified and tweaked. These items are offered for consideration in addition to the priority expenditures that were included in the original proposed operating budget for technology, professional learning, for early learning, and open campus. And so it is my view and the view of the team that all of the items can be considered crucial, should be considered crucial, for our ability to move forward in implementing our 5-year strategic plan, year one, phase one, year two, rather, and the whole notion of raising the floor and the ceiling simultaneously. So with that, I'll defer to our Chief Financial Officer, Dr. Thornton.
Thank you, Dr. King. Dr. Houston, school board members, good afternoon. Dr. King has provided a very thorough overview of the operating budget as originally proposed on February 19th. So what I'll do is just very briefly provide a visual of what Dr. King shared with you for the benefit of our stakeholders who are viewing by way of this web stream. So as Dr. King mentioned, our proposed operating budget as introduced on February 19th totals $321.1 million. This represents a $9.1 million increase when compared to the current year's operating budget, or just under a 3% increase from one year to the next. In terms of the changes to the operating revenue for next year based on this proposal, you'll recall that when this proposal was presented in February, it was based on former Governor McDonald's proposed budget as he presented in December of 2013. Since that time, we have been monitoring the state budget process, and we'll share more information in terms of an update on where we are with that. But this proposal, as introduced, is based on former Governor McDonald's original presentation without the adjustments that would come through the General Assembly approval process that is yet to be determined. So again, total operating revenues proposed is $321.1 million, and you can see the differences among the various categories of revenue. On the expenditure side, again, this budget would total $321.1 million, represent a $9.1 million increase. This budget proposal, again, as presented in February, it balances on paper, only to the degree that this proposal would require an additional $11.1 million of support from the locality or the city council beyond what our current local level of support is. And the expenditure changes, several of which Dr. King has already mentioned, include mandatory cost increases in state retirement system contributions on behalf of our employees totaling just under $5 million. Dr. King also mentioned an increase in health insurance rate for next year, estimated to be about 5%, which equates to $1.2 million. Again, as we've shared with the board previously, this estimate is subject to adjustment based on final projections from our insurance consultant in consultation with the city, because we have a jointly operated, if you will, consortium for providing health insurance for city and school employees and employees of NRHA. It also includes several other mandatory increases or required increases to maintain our current level of service, as well as some of those additional needs that would advance the school division's strategic plan that Dr. King mentioned, among them improvements to our current technology infrastructure, as well as the opening of a open campus high school academy. And again, the expenditure budget is $321.1 million as originally introduced. So in terms of our next steps, what I wanted to do was provide the board with a very brief update on the state budget picture. As you know, as I've mentioned, this proposal from a revenue perspective was based on former Governor McDonald's introduced budget in December. Since that time, the General Assembly has been in session. The House and the Senate versions are very different as it relates to what how our funding could change compared to Governor McDonald's. Under the Senate budget version, we would receive an additional approximately $1.6 million in state funding above what Governor McDonald's proposal would have provided. With reference to the House budget version, as we have seen it, we would only receive an additional $130,000, so there is a significant difference between the Senate version and the House version. We are, I would say, cautiously optimistic and hopeful that the Senate version would ultimately be approved as it relates to the General Assembly final action, which would provide us an additional upwards of $1.5 million in state funding. However, you also know that the General Assembly was scheduled to adjourn this past Saturday with the expectation of an approved budget for the next biennium. However, the General Assembly adjourned without approving a budget, and from what we read in the newspaper and the work that Dr. Simmons does from a governmental affairs standpoint, the hang-up in terms of what's prolonging the approval of a budget is not K-12 funding, but it's directly related to the debate over the expansion of Medicaid within the Commonwealth. So needless to say, we don't have a state budget at this point. We should have one, but we are waiting to see. I believe that Governor McAuliffe is planning to reconvene the General Assembly on March 24th to continue its discussions, and hopefully we will hear something very shortly after that with respect to the state budget as well as within that K-12 funding. But again, if the Senate version through the conferee negotiation process were ultimately approved by the General Assembly, we would expect to see an additional $1.5 million in state funding. But again, that's subject to the conferee negotiation process. That's where we are with the state budget. So again, ideally, we would hope that the Senate budget, the General Assembly version, would provide that additional funding. In terms of recommended adjustments to the superintendent's originally proposed, Dr. King mentioned to you that based on feedback from citizens through the public hearing process, and as well as doing some other research based on what our competitive position is in the region as it relates to teacher compensation and staff compensation, the most significant adjustment to the proposal that you'll see today is to provide funding for a across-the-board 2% salary increase for existing employees, and that increase would cost an additional $4.6 million above that which was presented in February. Be happy to answer any questions that you have at this point.
I'm grateful for the first response following your initial presentation on February 19th. I've been even further grateful for the response and the data that provided for additional amendments as a result of things that I have individually said. I get the whole idea of our positioning for principal salaries. Thank you. That makes sense. I'm still wanting to hear that we have, what is the line item, or what are we trying to do with CTE, just to make sure that we keep that hope and plan alive? And the second thing I'd like to hear is, what are we doing to try and add perhaps more to pre-K4, leading to all the pre-K4? And then I have a couple of additional questions.
So one approach we could take is to, you could finish going through this piece, and then we'll come back.
I'd be happy to also suspend both those questions and re-ask them later.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So what you have before you, you have a packet of documents, several documents. Included in that packet is, of course, the agenda for today's meeting that Dr. Houston referred to earlier. You also have in your package a one-page document, which you're familiar with, which outlines the revenue picture as well as the changes to the proposed budget. As I mentioned, the most significant change is highlighted in yellow in that second box. We provided hard copies for our stakeholders that are here participating in this process. But you will see in that second box highlighted there, the fifth item down, the 2% compensation increase for teachers and staff. Again, that would equate to approximately $4.6 million. That's the only change within that box as it relates to what you originally saw from the superintendent in February. Of course, that's an increase of $4.6 million, which would bring our projected base budget deficit or gap before any budget balancing strategies to $18.2 million, compared to where it was 13.6 previously. The next box would be the recommended budget balancing strategies. Again, we've highlighted for you the one area of change. Previously, we had contemplated the idea of offering a retirement incentive for a third consecutive year. But based on what our attrition rates have been, and based on consultation with our human resources staff and amongst cabinet, and some questions coming from board members regarding, do we really need to offer an incentive if we're going to have natural attrition? So we've taken that into account, and we're recommending at this point that we not offer that incentive, because we do believe that based on recent retirement trends, that we would expect to see a similar level of attrition and turnover due to retirement and just natural voluntary separation. So we're not, at this point, recommending that we offer that incentive. So we have taken that off of the proposed budget at this point. Now, we will factor in going forward an additional amount for attrition that we have included that we will include in the document as we go forward. You'll see highlighted there. The second line is highlighted $2.3 million. Previously, that item was $1.3 million, so we've taken that $1 million that would have come through the retirement incentive and basically describe it as natural attrition. Is that clear? So those are the two major changes. There are no other changes in the document in terms of proposal that you have before you today. As Dr. King and Dr. Houston mentioned, there are several other items that the board had asked for additional information on as it relates to CTE, and we'll be happy to walk through that document and then entertain any questions off of that. All right, the next document you have in your packet is a one-pager that, again, is intended to respond to some questions and requests that the board provided. The board wanted to see, at least over a 5-year period, what some of these additional costs, particularly the compensation 2% increase, would be over a 5-year period. And you see that first item here, this one-pager, is the $4.6 million for the 2% salary increase. And if you were to escalate that over a 5-year period through natural increases, then you would see what it would look like 5 years later. The next item that's listed there is CTE planning and design. This $6 million over 2 years represents the estimated total A&E cost for that estimated $85 million project. Now, if we were to limit the planning to just the schematic phase, and I appreciate Dr. Simmons sharing this with me, if we were to limit the initial design fees to just the schematic phase, we believe that that would cost approximately $1.2 million, or 20% of the total A&E design fee. However, at this point, that's not included in this proposed adjusted operating budget, because ideally, and through normal practice, your A&E design fees are part of your capital improvement plan budget. But the board wanted to see it, so that's why we have provided it to you here, but have not at this point included it in the operating budget itself. And then the other items on, yes.
Regarding that, I'd just like to make a statement. I trust that the city leadership will support the movement towards a CTE. Trusting that, I predict that if things begin moving very favorably, that the consideration of hiring a principal at some point will come in. So I reserve the right next year to say, should we look at adding such an item into the budget? But I think this answers all the questions that I will ask. Won't need to go back to that.
I mean, since we're there, and Dr. Thornton having given us an idea of what cost would look like associated with planning, my thinking is that we would limit spending related to planning to two major areas right now. Those two areas would be communications and marketing. I know we had started earlier this year developing a communications plan. I think that piece is really important, that we get a clear understanding before our community about what the CTE school is. There are a lot of folks that are still not really clear as to the fact that it is a comprehensive high school, that is not just a career and technical education school, and that it would attract from the entire district. As we talked about zoning with the Dion Richter study, there was still some misunderstanding related to that. So I think it's really important to get not only understanding, but buy-in and support from the broader community and all of our stakeholders. So I think that communications and marketing piece is a major step that needs to be taken next, in addition to programming. And I know some programming has, planning regarding programming has already begun, and but there's still, I think, quite a bit more to do as relates to acceptance criteria, application process, and so on and so forth. And so I would recommend that's not nearly as costly as a schematic, and certainly not as A&E, and it's something that's very much needed. And I think this upcoming year would be an important time for us to engage in that, and that's something I don't want to. I'm not the expert in this, but that's something that could be done probably for less than $100,000, but still a very important step towards the school. Yes.
I completely agree with that. I think that's wonderful, and it's wonderful that we're putting it in there. I just am going to predict the best, and the best is that things move very quickly. So next year at this time, we may be talking about getting someone who would be leading this whole process. I just don't want to say that this handles my 2-year anticipation. I anticipate moving a great deal faster with a great deal more enthusiasm from the city, whatever. But I agree with you. I think the communication piece is just critical.
Our question then at the end of this meeting is going to be whether or not we move this planning and design $3 million into this budget.
Or at this point, if we were to go through, from an A&E standpoint, if we were to limit it to schematic, because that would be the first step in the entire A&E process, to at least give our citizens an opportunity to see, based on programming, based on ed specs and programming,
Right.
which would be the initial first step. But then if we were to say we've got a program, and we also wanted to now go to a schematic design phase, it would be approximately $1.2 million
Right.
of that total $6 million.
So the decision really is what, if anything, and certainly I think we agree that something needs to be placed in the budget for planning for CTE, but exactly what does that look like? Not necessarily that 3.3 for A&E, but what amount is necessary for whatever we plan to do in the next fiscal year, as we move towards that.
If we did decide to just do the 1.2, would that come into the CIP?
Under normal practice, yes. Is it in the current CIP? Not to my understanding, not to my knowledge, it is not. Right.
Let me just do one more follow-up point to what I was mentioning. So, in addition to the marketing and communication, if we're going to put money in the budget to begin planning for architectural, engineering, et cetera, I think we need to form some type of a committee or a board on fundraising, have a goal set, and also have it designate, I guess through Kenyatta Goshen or whomever, to also look at grants and other monies that are out there for that. So if we're going to plan to do the design, let's also plan a goal of how much we want to have raised by a certain time. So that way we are planning with the idea that this whole process is going to occur.
Okay. Warren?
Several meetings ago, I began saying that this budget conversation is wonderful to me, and that we're looking at a 5-year master plan so that we can communicate to city leaders the big plan. This is what's going on, and it's wonderful. Tying it to CIP conversation, we have to have a much enhanced CIP based on several reports we were seeing from Rex Gay, from Technology, from DeJohn Rickner. I might favor deferring some of this, and I think that's what maybe Dr. Gabriel is referring to. I might favor deferring some of this to that CIP conversation, because it's going to have to be a much enhanced CIP approach to deferred maintenance, deferred technology, to a whole host of things related to the DeJohn Richter report. So as we talk about this, I may favor that, and I may look to the superintendent to make a recommendation, and ultimately may come down to the city telling us what we have and making the decisions at that time. But I really see it's critical that immediately following this budget cycle, like as in May 2nd, that we start a conversation about the master planning, and that CIP be critical in that.
You know, and I would add to that, if perhaps it's not in CIP, is it still considered a supplemental that the city would fund at 1.2, that would still get us on track to moving the whole project forward along the lines of what Dr. Gabriel was speaking? So it may not be even in our CIP, may not be in our operating, but it's a supplemental, because the city and us are both very much in favor of us moving forward.
And it would be considered a one-time cost as well.
Right.
So
Correct. Exactly.
if there was a one-time funding source for it.
Excuse me, Dr. King. The reason why, Dr. Houston, the reason why I favor considering something like that, is putting it in an annual operating budget means they're likely to see it year after year. This seems more like a one-time expenditure or whatever. So I may favor that, but again, I'm going to refer to Dr. King, working with Dr. Thornton to make that recommendation.
Okay. That's another hand? Okay.
All right, the other items listed on this one-pager are items that are, the third item there is the Open High School Academy. This item is already in the proposed budget, but I think there were some questions around it that the board may want to discuss today or get some additional feedback from staff members on.
So, Dr. Simmons, have we made progress, or have you been at a point where you can start seeking alternative funding for the open campus through grant support or otherwise?
We're in discussion, we're looking at grant opportunities right now. We really can't ask for money until the board has approved it, and we can move forward.
And is the board approval required via the budgeting process or separate and apart?
Via the budget.
Okay, because we don't need to technically approve it. There's no approval that the state's asking us to do or that our policies require us to do. Right,
Just budgetary.
exactly. Okay, I just wanted to clarify. So in essence, it's an implied consent through the budget.
Right.
Okay? Because I do think it's helpful if, when we find that alternative funding, it will offset that million. And it's not just going to be one-time offsets either, if these grants are multi-year. So I just would encourage us, as I've said in the past, for us to try to seek outside funding. This is a very worthy project, and I do think there's funding to be had.
There's a lot of federal money out there that we have identified. I have a grant writer. We just need to make sure we have a school that the board has approved before we submit.
Right.
So we're working it.
Yeah, just wanted to get clarification. I knew we had the projected deficit for the first year because we were getting started, but why are we projecting deficits out for all the way out to 2019? What's that?
Because we have not identified a sustainable revenue source to eliminate the year one deficit, so it would just grow as costs would continue to increase. So we don't have we don't have a sustainable revenue source to close the gap. So at this point, we don't have anything to make an assumption that we will have that additional revenue in years 2 through 5.
And that's inclusive of the concept of students re-enrolling in?
It is, yes. Only those kids that would re-enroll that are qualified that are qualified and eligible for us to receive the state funding. So there are some restrictions, age restrictions, and that pretty much drive what the state will provide. So it does show that we would grow the program with respect to those group of kids, and it also shows a growth in the state revenue, but not to the degree that it's going to close the gap. Because in years 1 and 2 right now, there is no, it's our understanding that the owner of the facility would waive the lease fees for years 1 and 2. But in years 3 through 5 right now, it includes bringing those lease fees into the budget that would be a cost to the division, short of some additional negotiations.
I'd also like to add, these are hypothetical assumptions based upon a 250 student population that graduates over a 5-year period. It does not erase the possibility that we can identify more dropout students, which is additional SRQ funding outside of what we would project here. So as we start the process and grow it, we can make adjustments for more revenue.
Right. The base year assumes 250 kids, year 1. Then, based on some program growth, it escalates the number of kids that were entered to the program, getting by year 5 to 500 total, including additional current dropouts. So it does begin to escalate in years 2 through 5. But again, it does not have an adequate amount of sustainable revenue to offset that growth at the same time. It does grow more kids. It does grow within that more current dropouts coming back in and the state money that would come with that. But again, that gap is still there in terms of a sustainable revenue source.
Erica, the need for our grant funding support.
We do have a grant that we submitted, and we were told that it will be approved once the school board approves the whole concept. So there is money on hold, not a lot, but it's moving in that direction.
In regards to the open campus, Dr. King, going back to our original conversations at the Hilton, when we had 2-by-2 conversations, it was my understanding that this wonderful, novel, exciting open campus initiative, working with Magic Johnson, and was just highlighted in Washington by the president of working with all these folks, was part of our transformational initiative. That was my remembrance. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So there was nothing ditched about that at all. This is a major continuation. It was a slight delay. I'm in the point of being a teacher right here, and also, I'm also in the point of building for a soliloquy I'll have later. So, thank you, sir.
Thanks for the one. Okay, Dr. Tony.
All right, the next item one of the questions that board members asked us to provide additional information around was some of the operating costs related to an expansion of the pre-K 4-year-old program. And we have here listed there some of the incremental transportation costs if we were to provide transportation, but it hasn't been determined that we would provide transportation at this point. But it could be based on preliminary estimates that we received from our transportation department, an additional $65,000 on top of the $2 million that we had previously included in the original proposal. But again, this would be contingent upon if if we were to provide transportation, but that decision hasn't been made because currently for our preschool program, our regular ed or non-special needs kids that are in preschool, we do not provide universal transportation, if you will. We've got some specific needs, but it's not looking at the entire 2,000-plus students that are in the program currently.
Completed walkthroughs on the projected 12 new classrooms to get a feel for the facilities cost. Had the opportunity to walk through those with Mr. Gay's designee, and we have a preliminary projection that ballpark, just based on preliminary estimates, that the retrofit cost for the 12 classrooms would be $144,000, and that had already been included in this estimate. So we're within range as well with the facilities cost.
Thank you, Dr. So within the $2 million that we originally proposed, we were, at that time, we were guesstimating that a $200,000 would cover at least some of the facility needs. And based on the walkthrough, the preliminary walkthrough, Dr. Zvigny is saying that there's a $140,000 potential cost, that would fit into the $200,000. But it's preliminary, it's based on a walkthrough and not necessarily which kids would come from where. And the last item on this list here, again, is the professional learning. Again, that's already in the original proposal for any additional conversation that the board had around that particular item.
Okay, so, thank you, Dr. Thornton. Here is, sure.
Just in terms of going back to the budget reduction.
Yes, sir.
Strategies.
Yes.
Please explain to me, it's not clear to me why we could not adjust the pupil-teacher ratios for elementary schools. Could you explain that to me again?
So now here's what I was going to propose we do. We were going to walk back through this entire piece
Okay.
so that, one, we can begin to move now systematically and methodically towards an agreement on some of these items. If we can determine what we both, and I'll use Warren's concept, what we understand and support, then we can begin to whittle this down to what we need to do by next week to get really clear on the budget that we will propose as a school board. And so we're going to walk block by block, okay? So if we go back to the expenditure-based budget, and I appreciate Dr. King, Dr. Thornton providing the additional recommended proposals to us, or adjustments to the budget, and I think this really helps us to see very, very clearly the work that we need to do as a school board. When we get to the start at the expenditure-based budget, there's not a lot of wiggle room or place for discussion in that box. I mean, it's pretty much, most of those items are pretty much non-negotiable. Of course, the one addition is the 2% compensation increase for teachers and staff. I want to stop here and see where we are in terms of agreement on this item. Are there any questions, concerns, comments? The 2% increase, yes.
I would like to have a discussion on Mr. Jordan's proposal that he submitted to us regarding a 2.5% increase for some of our veteran staff members, and then a 2% increase for other classified personnel.
Okay. And so for the benefit of the team, I would ask Rodney to just expound a little bit on what he, I mean, I know he submitted it, to expound on it, and then, I'm sorry?
That was version 1.0, yeah. But I have a question about that before I do that,
Okay.
if I can.
Okay.
Just for clarity, so the 2% here, that's across the board for everyone?
For all full-time
employees.
staff, yes.
Yeah, so what Dr. Gabriel was referring to, I sent some initial thoughts to Dr. King and to the board. At the time, trying to focus in on how do we retain those experienced teachers that we had some conversation around that we might be losing. And then I also was trying to go back to the class of the study that we had received. So I had put forward some initial thoughts of 2% for classified, 2.5% for that teacher group, but I hadn't envisioned it as across the board. So I don't know how you back out the across the board thing. So maybe we can come back and talk about that, because what I was really trying to do was to put forward some ideas for us to consider in terms of backing up what Dr. King said earlier in terms of trying to compete in the general marketplace,
Right.
but at the same time not balloon the deficit that much. And the other thing we had heard in terms of principals and administrators, that the research was showing that it's not necessarily salary, and since we're seeing that our principal salaries are already competitive, that rather than looking at it from a financial standpoint, that perhaps there are some things that the administration could look at in terms of burden reduction that would be an incentive for administrators while focusing on the salary adjustment for teachers and classified staff. So that was my thought process behind that.
Okay. And I would rather, so that we're not kind of all over the place and talking about something and then coming back to it, I would rather exhaust a point and reach a point of agreement, and then we move to the next item, and that way we know we're moving toward a conclusion and agreement on the budget. So the question I would pose right now is the board in support, or members of the board in support of any kind of tiered or differentiated approach to increased compensation? I mean, for me, that's the broader question. Is there interest or support in that concept at all?
I would favor it, and the reason that I would favor it is because when we received the pay and classification study that Dr. Birdsong presented, one of the graphs that the person highlighted was that there was a very alarming discrepancy of how we compensated our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers, our janitors, as opposed to some of our upper level administrators, which there was only a 4% difference. So if we're looking at trying to figure out where do we need the most money for the greatest benefit, I would say according to this data, it's very clear that our classified personnel needs much more attention at this point in time than some of our administrative personnel.
Okay. Other thoughts?
May I
Okay.
offer a comment?
Yes.
This is of course, very good discussion and very significant discussion, but I would remind the board that the study that was utilized included mega systems also outside of the state of Virginia, which could be a variable that you want to factor in or out. I just offer that for information. If you were to factor that out and consider the region, then the outcome of those numbers and the gap would change somewhat. So as we entered into this discussion, we really thought that as a team, the 2% across the board raise for certified and classified addressing principals, teachers addressing bus drivers, custodians, all of the above, when you cost that out and look at what that would do as far as beginning to at least allow us to remain as competitive as we are and not to see that gap widen, that we were getting some movement there. So, and I don't know if Dr. Birdsong wants to offer some additional comments on that, because part of the classified result, I believe, centered on the fact that the vendor also, the study entity, I should say, also included some larger systems outside that really pay more in a huge way compared to many of the systems even in our region. So with that, I'll ask for additional comments.
Good afternoon. I would like to add some clarification. Yes, with the pay and classification study, that group, the MAG group, they looked at for example, DeKalb County, they looked at Loudoun, they looked at Wake County, they looked at Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and quite honestly, when we look at teacher assistants and bus drivers, we should look within our region, because we're not competing with Raleigh, North Carolina for bus drivers and teacher assistants. And so what my team and I did, we wanted to make sure we had the data relative to Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Portsmouth, Suffolk, the surrounding Tidewater districts. And so when we looked at those numbers, we are very much competitive with surrounding districts. We are not off at all. In fact, when we looked at the midpoint, the beginning salary as well as the maximum salary for each of these districts, we were only off in one area when we looked at bus drivers, and that was with Virginia Beach for the midpoint. We were a little bit off from them. But otherwise, when we looked at specifically at bus drivers and teacher assistants, we were above them in all three areas: the beginning salary, the medium salary, as well as the maximum salary. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. So I think the data, when MAG looked at all of these surrounding other districts outside of Tidewater, it skewed the data somewhat.
Did we ask them to look at those other areas?
Yes, we did. When we started the study, we as a group came up with the areas they would look at, and typically that's what they do. They look at other urban districts that look like Norfolk Public Schools.
Well, it's just a little puzzling to me as to why we asked them to look for the information. We received the information, and now what we're doing is we're using information that is only within the region and not what we asked them to look at. Do you see what do you see what I'm talking about?
Yes.
So, I mean, I appreciate the clarity, but if we're not even gonna look at that information, or if we're just gonna say, we're just gonna put this and use this as other urban districts that we're gonna be competitive with, then I would like to know that from the beginning rather than begin to make assumptions that our cafeteria staff or janitorial staff, et cetera, are not competitive with
Right.
other districts. So,
We're on the same page.
okay.
So we want to be competitive throughout.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we began to look deeper with those numbers
Mhm.
is because we knew that we only have a finite amount of money to which we're going to have access. And so as we began our robust discussions around this in terms of determining how we could get the movement, because we knew we were not going to be able to close that huge gap overnight.
Right.
And so, to your point, we want to be competitive throughout, not
Mhm.
just within the region,
Mm-hmm.
but with the other urban systems. We want to be able to attract the best and the brightest from across the nation, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
But because of where we are now, we know realistically we're going to have to incrementally build that process. That's the reason you see a recommendation for the 2% across the board to do that, so that as we do so, then it allows us to position ourselves to maintain and in some cases ramp up our ability to attract and maintain, at least within the region. And then looking at phasing, because you see the numbers as we gave you the 5-year across the board costs,
Right.
then looking at, what's the forecast for the next fiscal year, and how can we look ahead to move forward to do what you're mentioning as well, because we knew we couldn't do it all in one fell swoop. So that was the thinking. And so, again, for the board, not to dismiss that figure, or those figures. We want to receive those and utilize that, but we know that we have to function in a way that we can phase in these items. But these are items for discussion, and I think you're right on point. If you want to go a different route, now would be the time to do that, because we costed it out as a 2% across the board, so.
I think we're on the same page with the 2%, so I guess, and I'm, spent the last few days thinking about and reminding myself of you being our expert, Dr. King. So I'm asking this question to you as a academic expert, which I'm not. What I was asking is, I'm supportive of the 2%. When I was looking at the data, for example, that we have before us in terms of principal salary right now, it seems that in every category, minimum, mid-range, and maximum, that Norfolk Public Schools is ahead of the game in that regard. So my question is, if we did the 2% for classified and 2.5% for teachers, and did not do an increase for administrators, does that make sense in terms of where you think we should go? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Repeat your figures for me again, please.
So-
2% classified and,
Right, so you all had 2% across the board.
right,
And I noticed that on one of the scenarios we had with the additional contract day, it was a 0.5% salary increase for teachers was $800,000. So if you did 2% for classified and 2.5% for teachers, and that was the only increase that we did, would it come out to about the same amount? Is what I'm trying to figure out.
If we were to do a 2.5 for teachers, it would be approximately $4 million. If we were to do a 2% for classified, it would be approximately $1.2 million, not including any administrative staff, but just classified. Not including principals, of course, and other administrators. So, again, 2.5 for teachers, based on it would be 4 million, and classified would be 1.2. So
So
roughly
it's-
5.2 million.
So it's 600 more than what you
Correct.
currently had.
Another thought along that line, too, when you, as a part of our discussion, centered on the whole notion of, again, being able to attract, being able to retain, be able to position ourselves to move to the next level. And so we had discussions about classified, we had discussions about the teachers in the classroom, we had discussions about building level leaders and the things that we need. And really settled on the point that where we are in terms of the status quo and our needs and the implications for training and beginning to train in a way that all of us will be required to make the paradigm shift to do the work differently, that there's a different requirement on the building level leader as well. So everybody's included in this process in terms of the needs. And a huge discussion around what you see here as a line item centering on professional learning. It means if many of these recommendations go forward, it means to continue to train and retrain building level leaders, central office staff, continue the robust training with teachers so that we're able to embrace all of the things that are important for moving literacy and numeracy forward. I won't continue to sing that song. You all know what I mean. And so to ramp that up, we felt that to really hone in on those items across the board would position us to be able to do that better. Because we are discussing the need of additional professional learning days, for example. And so, to begin to get the time that's necessary to train, continue training with principals and continue training with teachers and the work that has to be done from a classified standpoint for PBIS, bus drivers, with where we need to go with cafeteria workers that are having to feed more and more students proportionately because of our rates and numbers going up. That it was very difficult to go the differentiated route. And that's why you see what you see.
Couple of points here. Number one, realize that the private sector has not been able to provide the same level of increases that they have over the last 3 years. 7% 2 years ago, 2 years, 2% last year, 2% this year. I'm not against giving the teacher, the staff a raise, to realize that this is out of what the private sector is doing. With that said, I can support the 2% increase, but we can't, we got to figure out what we can afford to do. Second thing is I just lost it, so that's all I'm going to say right now.
Can I offer just a little bit of budgetary context? Because the cost of a 2% for our principal, building level leaders, principals and assistant principals, the cost of a 2% is $100,000 in the context of a $5 million 2%. So and then whatever the message is that could come a result, or if we decided to differentiate principals versus teachers, or the lead teacher, as Dr. Stewart calls it. So just, again, from a budgetary perspective, a 2% for principals and assistant principals or future principals would only cost, I would say only, but it's $100,000.
I do think we need to consider the 2% across the board. I think that's a good thing for us to consider, especially given the competitive nature of trying to attract and retain qualified personnel. I also think that, to your point, Dr. King, we're trying to do as much as we can for professional development. So 2% plus professional development, plus we're doing the VRS, which we're required to do, and we're not asking anybody else to do that. That's our responsibility. But that, I think, would be very beneficial to all in the division this year. I just think going down the next few line items, we need to be very aware of, can we demonstrate the need? What's the ROI? Do we need to do as much as what we're proposing? And can we find additional monies that then take away the 4.6 million kind of nut in some other fashion? So I think, we're only early in that box. I think there's other things that we need to look at. Personally, I know when we get to the next box of reductions and balancing strategies, I'm going to ask my repetitive question of, have we continued to look at all programs, and are there any further reductions we should be considering there that would then allow for this 4.6, again, to not be so great in the budget?
Thank you.
Yes, original budget priorities in October was that we would increase the salary of teacher and staff across the board 2%, and I support that. I think that was the right direction that we originally determined to go. And also, I was just sharing with the administration that I noted that we had a figure of about $48,000 for professional development that was increased to $700,000. So that's quite an increase in professional development and learning, which I think we need. So it shows the commitment of the administration to target that area, because it definitely is going to show the results in the learning of our kids. So I think that both of those items are important, and I certainly support them.
Thank you.
Once again, Dr. Gabriel has brought out some information which further emphasizes my hope that on May 2nd, we'll turn to master planning, and that we'll begin looking at all of these things in context, so that there won't be these late-breaking items next year, that we'll see everything together. But I think what Dr. Gabriel has brought out is critical. I just don't want to lose it, and if we don't act on it this time, if we're going to maintain the 2% as we have it, and I can support that, and we supported it from the beginning, that we don't lose the whole idea that there's a lot more to be done in that area, particularly building on the study. But I really, really support the points made by Dr. King, in that we've got to work in this region first before we begin looking at Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and other places.
Thank you. And so, before we leave this point, it sounds like the majority of us are in support of the 2% across the board. Okay? Sure.
I think we need to get a little bit more clarity on the study that we received at a different point in time, maybe when we have the May 2nd discussion, because I clearly remember her telling us that our whole salary system was not
You did.
up to par. She said all we've been doing is just doing 2%, 2%, and we've kind of been inching and inching and inching along the way, and it's been flat across the board. And she said what you really need to do is change your system altogether. And if we're looking to, and if we're paying people to come and tell us this information, then we need to know exactly what we're asking. We need to understand the information that we're going to get and be ready to do something about it. Because again, what I see us doing is the same thing what she had mentioned brought us to this situation. And I'm okay with the 2% increase at this point in time. But I am very concerned with the fact that we have this study here, and I do understand, I'm looking back and I do see all of the areas that were included, which did include Hampton, Newport News, Portsmouth, Suffolk, and Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake. But I just want us to make sure that when we are searching out information and we receive it, we're going to do something with it. So I'm going to put that on the table for May 2nd then.
Okay. All right. So the other items in this first box, I don't know if there are questions about any of the line items. I would ask Dr. Thornton if you would say a little bit about the office staff positions, the student data support.
Okay. The line item that Dr. Houston is referring to is the second from the bottom, restore student data support, SDS, office staff positions at some of our smaller elementary schools. You remember that a couple of years ago during our similar budget challenges, one of the decisions that was made was to cut those, as we refer to them as SDS staff members, and they primarily, as I understand it, support student information, student attendance, all of those other office activities that take place in every elementary school. But I think we made a decision to reduce those number of positions at 9 of our smaller elementary schools. And you have heard, at least in the short time I've been here, from our citizens and staff regarding the impact, the negative impact that's had on the building. It's created a lot of turnover, and Dr. Birdsong can probably attest to that. It's created a lot of turnover in the office staff. It's also, some could say it's affected the climate in the building. And quite honestly, I think we have backfilled those positions with some part-time substitutes, and that creates issues with continuity and consistency of delivery of service. So that's what this would do. It would restore those previously cut 9 positions at an estimated cost of $270,000.
Thank you. So are there any questions or comments at all on any of the other line items in the expenditure-based budget box?
Can I just highlight one?
Yes.
The item, health insurance, second one down, health insurance 5% premium increase. Again, this is based on the preliminary estimate in terms of what our rate increase is expected to be for next year. When I say preliminary, we're still working with, we being the city and schools are still working with the consultant to really look at what our rate changes are going to be for next year. This, again, is based on 5%, and in this proposal, it would assume that we would absorb that on behalf of employees and not pass any on. But again, we're part of a consortium with the city and the Redevelopment Housing Authority, so I would think as a consortium, we want to be sensitive to what each member is doing. And we haven't heard what the city is doing at this point because they haven't rolled out their, the city manager has not rolled out his proposed budget. So that would be the one variable at this point.
The good news is that the estimates each year for the health insurance cost is normally below what,
Just jinxed it.
sorry. I hope that's the case.
We're hopeful that this would be the maximum increase.
Right. Okay.
The line item of rebasing the position and compensation budget,
Yes.
is that something that we do typically every year, or are you doing it this, or are we doing it this year?
We typically, we rebase the compensation budget. This year, we had to increase it as we go forward for next year because you remember, we had some reorganization and we had to do, we added a few positions. We had to bring in some positions that were previously under some federal grants that after the budget process, we found out, really, that the funding would not be there for those positions. So we, instead of basically riffing them, we brought them into the operating budget. So this rebasing, which adds to the budget,
Right.
is to account for those positions.
Is that likely to happen year after year, or are we kind of
It sh-
caught up this year?
It should be caught up.
Okay.
Now, we've got sequestration that's still kind of lingering out there, but at this point, we don't know that we're going to have to bring any additional grant-funded positions into the operating budget after this process.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we see that total at $18.2 million. And so now we move down to the recommended expenditure reductions and balancing strategies. I know Reverend Haywood had a question about the pupil-teacher ratio.
Yes, Dr. Thornton, I had,
Yes.
I'd ask you this question. It's not clear to me as to why we would not also consider this on the elementary level. Now, I recognize that this is not a popular strategy.
Sure.
I mean, this is not something that we would want to do, but is it possible to do on the elementary level?
Well, I would say at this point, it's not. Reason being is because when we look at our K-3 class sizes, we receive approximately $7 million from the state as an incentive to maintain smaller class sizes. And that's driven primarily by free and reduced lunch, or poverty, if you will. So in order for us to be eligible for that $7.2 million, we have to maintain, we cannot let our class sizes within K-3 exceed a certain number. So we have limited to no flexibility on K-3. In terms of 4-5, we're already at an average of 24 to 25. So in terms of flexibility there, very limited to none. So K-5, basically none, because of state funding and then just optimal class sizes already met.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And so we know that, thank you, so we know that all of these line items reflect attempts to reduce our expenditure base. And, of course, Courtney mentioned that this was the box she was waiting on, so.
Just two thoughts on this. Have we really done a very thorough and complete program review to determine whether or not there's program creep, and/or are we using programs to their max?
I'll defer to my colleagues, though, from an instructional program and other program perspective, with reference to what we've done. We have, and we're continuing now, to look through the expenditure budget, not from a programmatic standpoint, but then I'll ask them to respond to your question on program evaluation and adjustments. But over the last week, when we heard from the citizens, and Dr. King put us together and said we needed to address the compensation issue. So he asked that me and my staff go back and look through the budget again, analyze the budget, look at our expenditure cost trends across 7,000 plus budget lines. And it sounds like a lot of lines, but that's what it is. So we're doing that, and we would expect that we will be able to make some other minor adjustments that are not reflected here that we'll share with you on next Wednesday that will reduce the gap. It's really going to be, in the context of a $15 million gap, it's going to be, at best, maybe $1.5 million more in reduction. But that doesn't come as a result of program changes. So I'll refer to my colleagues if they want to add from a programmatic perspective.
From a programmatic perspective, we did reduce the use of many programs at the end of last year based on evaluation that was conducted last school year. There are a couple other programs that are on the table that are phasing out this year because their contracts expire, and we will not be renewing those contracts. And then all of the current programs that we have on the table, we're conducting our own internal analysis. The vendors have done analysis of usage for us, and we're looking at those results ourselves. And we will be in a better position, as Dr. Norton said, to share that next week.
Great.
So we're looking.
Good, thank you.
That's in addition to what I just mentioned to you.
Yes.
Right. It would be in addition to.
The Other point I would make is, clearly the kind of elephant in the room is we still don't have the white smoke coming out of the DeJohn Richter report. And that could at some point render additional savings, maybe not this next budget year, but in the years to come. So to Dr. Stewart's point of, looking at the 5-year budget forecast, we need to look at what that study can do to help us be more efficient in our spend. So I just want to throw that out there again, because we don't have answers to that yet.
To add to the points related to program evaluation, hopefully as the work continues, there will be items that we can tighten. However, as we really look at where we are, the examples that I can anticipate, and that members of the team, of course, can interject or lead us in a modified direction, but it's centering on, for example, as you analyze the programs that we're utilizing, like My Access, Achieve 3000, Read 180, et cetera. Usually there's a requirement for licenses and that kind of thing in terms of numbers. What we're doing is looking at, we know we need those items to support the curriculum and moving it forward in terms of getting the results that we need to begin to secure, with using these items as a supplement to that process to accelerate the movement. The review centers on looking at the number of licenses at a certain location and how much usage and caseload and all those kinds of things. I only mention that because I don't anticipate huge savings around that, but any savings would be better than, what status quo reflects. And so, though it may, maybe I'm more pessimistic than I should be in that regard, but I know the information will come back to us and will be quantified by Dr. Thornton, but know that that's the direction in which we're heading to make sure we have the best utilization, the most efficient utilization of those programs. So.
Brad and I just want to show my appreciation to the administration for doing just that, because that's something that I've been asking each year I've been on the board, to know that we are spending the taxpayers' money in the most effective and efficient manner possible. And I encourage you to continue that process. I know Dr. King has made it a priority to do that, and Dr. Svigny, Dr. Simmons, and Dr. Thornton are all working with their teams to do that. And I just want us to continue on so that when we go and ask the taxpayers, because that's who ultimately pays for this, for more, I want to know that we're using our dollars as best we can. Noel?
I appreciate that as well. I know that's something that we've definitely brought up in discussion. What I would say is that while we may not get a full review next week, I completely understand. I'll also put that on the agenda for May 2nd, our theoretical date for program analysis, because it is very important that we analyze what programs work, what programs are successful, and if we're seeing great achievements in certain programs and programs that attract students, such as Young Scholars and the Magnet program, then why not increase funding to those programs and maybe decrease funding to others? So while we may not see a decrease in the amount of funding, we might see a shift in how funds are being spent. So I think it's an analysis that certainly needs to happen and would definitely be very appropriate for our discussion of our 5-year plans.
So those reduction strategies total, as we see that $10.9 million that brought the previous budget gap down to $7 million. And then we get into the additional funding priorities related to technology. And I would simply point out, and I'm not sure Dr. Thornton did, that about $1 million of the $4.4 million would be support, staffing support, and the other infrastructure. And how much of it did you say would be reoccurring
The staff
Approximately.
costs. The staff costs would be a reoccurring
Mhm.
cost, of course, because it would be full-time contracted employees.
But not all of the infrastructure would be reoccurring with it.
It wouldn't be reoccurring in a sense that it would be replacing some existing
Mhm.
infrastructure
Mhm.
that has a more extended useful life, but so we wouldn't have to replace the same thing over and over again each year. So in that sense, it's not reoccurring, but I believe Ms. Sikora will say that what we would replace is an incremental. It's not the full replacement.
Correct.
But it wouldn't have to be done, the same thing wouldn't have to be replaced in year 2.
Right,
Right, there's a sustainability piece that would be built into that.
right.
But the lacking the support piece of that 3.4 would move us toward our 5-year plan for IT, and that would be year 1.
Right.
So we would see a similar cost as we move through
Gotcha.
the next
Understand.
years of the plan.
Okay.
I want to emphasize again, I'm looking forward to May 2nd because I think CIP has to reflect a great deal more what you're talking about here. We're going to need a whole lot more than we could ever put or would want to put in an annual operating budget. People, yes. So I hope that as we look at many items following this budget discussion, so next year at this time, we'll be at a much different place. But CIP and supplemental has got to be a place that we look at some of this. We can't do this, cannot do it in the annual operating budget, would not be the best for the city.
Courtney, and then Rodney.
Forgive me for going back one box, but just one final question on the balancing strategies. Dr. Thornton, is the 3.5 million still the current projection of the carry forward fund projected?
Well, I was going to go back to that box too, so.
I was too.
There you go.
The
I would never
3.5
forgive you all
million.
for going back to that
Sir?
box. I would never forgive you all for going back to that box.
The 3.5 million is the estimated current year projected year-end savings that could be applied to next year's budget as a one-time revenue source. This is a little more, this is about half of what we used this year. Because the idea is that if we're going to bring some structural balance over a 5-year period, then we've got to begin to make some of these tough choices and not continue to rely on one-time funding. Did that answer your question?
But at this point, the projection is still 3.5.
It's 3.5. I don't want to go too far this early in the year. Well, I say early because we still have 4 months remaining in the fiscal year. We haven't gotten through the winter months with utilities and some of the other fuel costs. So I don't want to go too far in terms of hanging a number out there much larger than 3.5, around which we're going to make some budget decisions. So could it be a little more? Yes. But would I recommend that we add it to the budget going forward? No. If we end the year with a little more, then to Dr. Stewart's point, if we find that we have some one-time infrastructure needs that can be addressed, then if we have those monies remaining at the end of the year, we could let it roll into the fund balance and then perhaps ask, as we've done in the past, ask City Council to reappropriate it for those one-time needs. And I would suggest that we consider that as a strategy if we can't get full funding, that to whatever degree we may have additional fund balance, and I'm not saying what that's going to be at this point, but to whatever degree it is, then we could consider using that or a portion of it to address one-time infrastructure, non-recurring needs. And we would know that in September. I don't want to spend it or say we can use it before we've gone through the audit process.
Rodney?
Yeah, I was going back to the previous box also, and I don't want to get too detailed in terms of what you all described in terms of your program analysis, but I just wanted to ask one specific related to what we received last year, and that was around the Breakthrough to Literacy program. And I know at that time we had indicated that there were costs associated with the program and some personnel costs associated with it, but it was being phased out, and so we're going to look at a differentiated strategy. Is that included in that? Have we done that, or is that's gone? So all of those, whatever those projected savings are already accounted for?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
But I reserve the right to come back.
Okay, back to box 3. Of course, inclusive, and that is the professional development as well as the preschool early learning piece, which Dr. Savigny referenced, related to infrastructure needs totaling about $144,000.
Preliminary projection, yes, based on walkthroughs of the existing locations.
I can appreciate all the qualifiers that you and Dr. Thorne are using. Let me be very clear.
Hopefully it's not overused, but it's important to say those qualifiers.
And of course, the open campus support as well. Questions or comments about the additional funding priorities?
I have a culminating question at the end. I'd like to hold it to the end.
Yes.
Rodney?
So, first on the technology infrastructure and support, I know I had asked a question about the lockbox that was associated with the 4-cent tax increase from last year. And I understand we're not sure what's in that lockbox, but would resources that are potentially in that lockbox apply to this line item?
By description, again, I'm being very clinical here, but by description, it's construction, technology, and infrastructure.
Correct.
Would there be enough? The construction was related to future debt service. Would there be enough in whatever that deposit is going to be? I don't know at this point, because we haven't received the estimate from the city. We know what we budgeted, what the city said to budget, what it would generate, but at this point, no transfers have been made. I think the city is still in the process of going through the reassessments to see how much of the 2-cent that was intended for construction and technology and infrastructure, how much of the 2-cent through the reassessment process is really going to be generated toward that lockbox. So that number right now was budgeted at 3.3, but we haven't, the city is still going through the process of assessing and estimating how much is actually going to be generated from that 2-cent.
Just for clarity, are you saying that 3.3 was for the entire amount, or 3.3 towards the technology component?
The 3.3 was described as funding to support construction, technology, and infrastructure.
Right.
And the city staff wanted us to be wanted us to be very clear in describing it that way.
Right, wasn't it like 2 cents for one thing and 1 cent for another? And
2 cent for
Construction.
construction debt,
Right.
1 cent for the school division's operating budget to basically support some of the other initiatives we had, and then the other penny was for city to support their salary increase that we were doing on this side. 2 for CIP, and 1 for operating schools and city.
It's like, I guess my question / point is, in looking at that, it would seem to me that this additional funding priority, at least as it relates to technology, infrastructure, and support, would align with what's already been identified as a priority and a function. And so maybe we should highlight that or identify that in some way so it doesn't look like it's completely outside of some agreements and parameters that have already been set. And then secondly, if there's some way to then quantify that, it may change
Correct.
how these
Correct.
numbers appear.
That's right, that's right. And as soon as we get some information from the city on that, and find out from them if that's possible for something other than future debt, then we would share that. Once we get the number, and then the next question is, can it be used for that infrastructure?
And then
So now I don't know.
on the professional development, I know that we're using caveats, but can I get you to kind of go to the sign in blood level of giving some assurances that from existing funds that we currently already have, federal, state, and other resources, that we don't have within our current capacity, the ability to handle the professional development piece. Again, in the 719, there's positions, right? I think it's 2 positions, and then there's professional. Okay, it's 5 positions and training. So well, can you all remind me again what the 5 staff positions are, and then what the training piece is?
Coordinator, and then 2 coach positions who focus on literacy and 2 coach positions who focus on numeracy, since those are our 2 greatest area of challenge at the moment. And those individuals would be in the classrooms every day working with teachers. So those would be additional boots on the ground, so to speak. And then the coordinator would serve as the hub of all the professional learning that we need to implement and will continue to implement.
So then, all of that then is for individuals. It's not necessarily sending people to training, it's people getting training inside the classroom.
You'll remember the 5-year projection that we did. It was broken down by training topic. There was one of the training venues, so to speak, was for certain administrators to go on a rotating basis to annual type conferences. But the majority of it, in fact, I would venture to say 99% of that training is internal, bringing folks to us so we don't have the travel cost associated.
Or online.
I'm sorry?
Online.
Yes, or online, yeah.
So that is I guess back to my original question, that's something that is completely outside of resources that we currently have.
Right, and as I shared via email, because we have such a diverse community in terms of educational offerings, they're very savvy and they tap into that federal pot of money. And the revenue stream that we utilize the most for professional learning, we share with many other individual organizations.
Brad?
Just for clarification, you say you're adding 2 more literacy and 2 more.
These would be district-wide trainers.
District-wide trainers.
District-wide trainers.
So this is a completely new category for us?
These are new positions. We have district-level coaches. They're teacher support specialists now, or teacher specialists now. And these individuals we're trying to fine-tune so that they are in the classrooms every day. They're not in this building working on curriculum. They are out every day training, working with teachers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Stalling for Warren here. Dr. Savigny, why is the amount for professional learning reduced in the preceding year, the coming year? Why is that reduced?
Because some of the training are, you've heard me use the term before, backfill. We're going back and filling in things that we, in theory, should have already done. So once we get those holes filled, so to speak, then as we're moving forward, we move into maintenance, which we can do ourselves, so the costs go down.
Okay, any other questions on staff development?
I had a couple of comments.
Professional development, yes.
I'm definitely in support of a professional development coordinator, the literacy coaches, and the numeracy coaches. Do we have a job description yet for those positions?
We do.
Okay. And we'll need to add them on our schematic just to see who they'll fall under, et cetera. But as far as the additional professional development in which we're doing cohorts, for example, gifted cohorts, math specialists, reading specialists, we're going to be paying for all of the teachers to do that. It's going to come out of NPS's pot of money, so to say.
That figure listed covers a third of the tuition.
A third, okay.
It's a third of the tuition.
Okay.
It does not cover, because those are graduate level courses.
Okay.
So it does not cover full tuition, and
Okay.
that is the practice that was
Mhm.
established here in Norfolk, and we're
Mhm.
currently doing that with a couple of cohorts already.
Well, I actually like that even better, because that means that those who want to take on that challenge, or to become gifted certified, or become an administrator, or really want to do this, and then we're kind of helping them along. So I actually like that even better. I think that's about it. I think professional development is very critical, as Dr. Savigny has stated, and as Dr. King has mentioned. So if we wanted to do anything to change professional development, if you wanted to put it up into the base portion of the budget, I would be okay with that.
Say that one more time.
Putting professional development and school leadership into the expenditure-based budget.
Okay. All right, yes.
Question on that. There's one small item that I don't see here reflected, and it was something that I mentioned as a result of last meeting's DeJohn Richter report. I'm assuming that we have somewhere in our budget funds that could continue our communication with Mr. Richter and company, because we're going to need to be able to do that. Would that come under this, or would that come some other place?
There's still funding remaining on the original purchase order.
For next year and
That could
subsequent
roll
years?
to next year.
Good.
Right.
Sorry.
It's not an unlimited amount, but there is some still remaining.
Just so we have that accommodation and the ability to let him be of assistance to you and your colleagues as we want to. Thank you.
Okay. Preschool, early learning.
Can I go back for a
No.
minute? I know you're pushing us through it. I have to leave at 3:30 anyway. But just another question on the professional development piece, which I do consider a priority. I've said that. Can we reprogram any of the Title II or Title I or other resources that we have that would allow for us to accomplish the goal without putting the professional development at the, for lack of better terminology, at the mercy of trying to make the argument for additional local funding? You know, again, you all have to tell me whether that makes sense or not, but is there any way that you could take, however you're currently using Title II, Title I, and reprogram it so that these 5 or whatever other professional developments you need fall within that funding stream, and maybe there's something else that then comes out on the other side that is considered an additional tier request?
That's a very good question. And we have to remember that the Title I and Title II pots of money are governed by federal regulations, not state regulations, but federal regulations. And if we have identified these as needs at the district level, and we all agree these are district level needs, then we cannot use Title I to pay for them. That would be considered supplanting, because you would have to use local funds to pay for the non-Title I schools and title funds to pay for the Title I schools, and you cannot do that because this is a district level need. So we're precluded from doing that with Title I funds. That's a federal regulation. We have there's no way to move around that.
So even if, I can't remember what it is at the elementary school level, but if 30 of 35 are, whatever it is, 31 of 35.
Then to be in compliance with federal regulations, that would be something that we would have to pay for at the local level, not using Title I, if it's something that we've identified district-wide.
So I think what Ron is asking is, those schools that are Title I schools, because the initiative would be district-wide, you couldn't even use Title I money for those Title I schools.
That is correct. Now, there is professional learning money allotted inside each principal's base allotment. Principals get X amount of money based on per pupil, full-time enrolled students in their buildings who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And again, it's a complicated formula that I'm very much simplifying. Principals determine based on their individual school improvement plans how they allocate their money based on the spreadsheet. We don't tell principals how to spend their money. Principals determine how to spend their money. So there is professional learning dollars that principals have the option to allocate inside their Title I budget. But if these, and the things that we're talking about here are district-wide initiatives, they're K-12 initiatives. So it would not be appropriate under the federal regulations to use Title I dollars to pay for those. And with Title II, we don't determine that formula that I tried to explain in email. We don't determine that, the federal government does. And right now, there are 89 external agencies that dip into that money.
So could I just ask one other, just mathematical. So if 90% of our elementary schools were Title I schools, and each of those schools had a need for professional development and identified as such in their plan, would they then be able to request that? And the other 10% that did not qualify, would they be able to fall into a local pool?
Well, again, it gets to, is that identified as a need at the elementary level across the district? If it's identified as a need at all 33 schools, elementary schools, then using Title I dollars, whether it's at the building level or at the district level, we're in very gray area there, and walking a very thin line between supplementing and supplanting. So if we begin the conversation and say, well, these 3 schools are not Title I, so we'll pay for it with this pot of money, but these schools are Title I and they can use their Title I dollars, then by definition of the federal reg, that's supplanting. So we have to, and that can get us in big trouble.
And I, the point I'm trying to make is just to make sure that if we're going to go to the locality and ask for these additional funds that we're going to include over a 5-year period, that we can just be clear about why we're asking the argument that we're making so that they understand the critical nature of the request.
Well, and to that point, of course, the vast majority of our schools that we serve under title are title.
Right.
And so then when you look at those schools have particular needs. And in many cases, those needs can be addressed through title dollars. Now, those schools outside of the title designation also have needs. Those needs, if we're meeting the needs of our non-title schools in the same way as we are with title, then we cannot use title funds for that purpose. So in other words, what Dr. Savigny was referring to a few moments ago centers on the fact that what you do in your title schools must be different and aligned with the needs of those students in the school outside of a non-title program. If not, then it is supplanting. So what we're attempting to do is to be very selective and strategic about how we do that, so that each school individually has its own Title I plan that aligns with its needs. Therefore, then we can use our title funds to address that need. And then those schools that are remaining that are not title, and they have their particular needs, usually will be a bit different than those, and we can pay for those in a different sense. So that's the route that we're taking now, but attempting to do it in a way that it will free up the local dollars so that we can take advantage of the opportunities and minimize the costs for us in this way. So, and that's an ongoing everyday discussion and review. So,
For the Title I dollars for our schools that are set to be choice within the transformation, we could technically use those dollars then for their professional development, if I'm hearing you correctly?
All of our schools are school-wide, which means every child who's inside the building and every staff member who's inside the building qualifies for the services associated with those dollars. So when principals are allocated their funds and they develop their plan, Every student and every staff member inside those buildings is 100% eligible to receive those services. So they will continue to receive those, and as students roll into those buildings, as long as the school remains designated as school-wide, that will not change, depending upon any child who enters the building.
So, I mean, for example, we have a separate section here for the professional learning associated with transformation. And those schools are Title I. It would be different than what we would be doing at other schools. So if we needed to maybe do some reprogramming of how funds are spent, it could potentially apply for some of these schools in transformation.
Potentially, yes.
As long as we're not providing the same
Right.
training in another
At
type.
another school,
Yeah.
right, which, okay.
Okay. Well, so we're making good progress. Let me suggest we take a quick 10-minute break, and we should be able to finish up in an hour with regards to where we are. So let's do a 10-minute stretch break, and then we'll come back at it, okay?